The last session of the conference will start now. It will be an open discussion introduced by Professor Bal. So I give the word to Professor Bal.
In this cluster of conferences, we are trying to check unorthodox paths, the content, the format, the forms of interaction, which leads to unexpected situations like the one you saw today morning. So I thought, and then Sadanand thought, and then Rajaram thought, and then Jacob, and in other words, we thought, that we should raise some issues at a conceptual level. This is important, conceptual level, because the issues that we are raising, I want to first, that won't be the only issue, but I'll be introducing one such. Either, depending on how you look at it, suggests and shows that the public and the private distinction works differently in India when compared to the Western culture. Or, if you like the other formulation, such distinctions do not exist here. Doesn't matter how you look at it, that is not important. I want to bring onto the table, not so much the incident, but the responses to it from yesterday. In the Roundtable session, when Farah Godrej presented her paper, I hear she's not here. It's a pity. Some of us and I raised some issues. Now, as is typical in my experience of America to begin with, basically, I'll talk about it in a minute. It's an American phenomenon, North American phenomenon, which has seeped into Europe and to India, where one discusses in private, not discusses, one gossips in private, tells poisonous things in private, about intellectual issues that should be discussed openly in the public. For example, the reactions to yesterday's talk, yesterday's session was that we represented a firing squad. That we should start deeply reflecting about how we talk. Self-reflection. I went and spoke to Farah Godrej because Vivek insisted I do so. So she found that we were rude, that we were not generous, that we had not understood her article, and so on and so forth. After which I simply shrugged my shoulders and walked off. What's interesting about this incident, you ask? What's interesting about it is the way people have reacted. Now, conferences, ideally speaking, they were also that until the end of Second World War, is where intellectual minds meet, criticize each other fiercely because it's criticism in the realm of ideas, change their minds, change their opinions on the basis of such intellectual interactions, and contribute further to knowledge. This is what conferences were, and this is the conference we want to be. We insist on being that. This is not simply a European phenomena. Those of you who know anything about Indian history know too that very critical, very sharp, very severe disagreements, dissents, debates and discussions were part of the Indian traditions, intellectual traditions. What has happened, and this is now my understanding, is that there is something called Cold War social science emerged, which is now being studied as Cold War social science after the Second World War, which basically is America's contribution to the world, one of America's contributions to the world. And what did this Cold War social science do? Well, it has completely destroyed, poisoned intellectual research. The abysmal state of social sciences today is a result of this Cold War ideology, this Cold War social science. This led to the following phenomena that you will observe in every single conference in America, which is that it is simply a place where you do the networking. You go there, you cite each other. That's what Farah Godrej did. So what I'm expected to do is to cite her. She pats me on the back for writing a good article. I pat her on the back of writing a good article. And then Stephen Smith and I go sit in a bar and say, what a shitty article that was. And this is what Americans do. They have made a culture, they have made a tradition, they have made a pattern. In fact, they have made an institution of this way of dealing with things. Canadians have very eagerly taken it over. And of course, unfortunately, this has come to Europe and to India, coupled with this extraordinary idea of political correctness. Public praises, private poison. I have yet to come across a single serious discussion in any American conference or miss this poisonous gossip that they carry on in the private. So yesterday, and then they always come up with this moralizing discourse. They have to learn manners. So it's the task of the Californians and the Canadians to come and teach us manners, how to behave. We're such barbarians, we don't even know that. Because anything that doesn't correspond to their way of, their idea of manners, which is hypocritical praise in the public and poisonous gossip at the back, they think is manners. Well, it is, maybe. But that's not what conferences are about. This is not a social party. We don't sit here drinking a cocktail and praising each other. How beautiful you look, my dear, when you think to yourself, what kind of an awful sari she's wearing. That is good for that's good for chit-chats in parties. But it's totally inappropriate, totally unsuited for an intellectual meeting of minds where search for truth must be central. Let me tell you what my perception was of yesterday. Farah said I hadn't read her paper. I can even now repeat the summary of her paper. She didn't even understand what she had written, but she was citing us all the time. She is the one who didn't understand. Second, I asked her questions she hadn't thought of, she could not answer. So instead of being grateful for the intellectual attention she received for the questions, she finds me rude. We are called firing squads. As though she came here to demonstrate how intelligent she is, how learned she is, and we are only supposed to nod our heads and say, yes, what a wonderful paper, Farah. And then talk amongst ourselves how absolute trash it was. I'm not saying her paper was trash, but I'm saying we raised questions which you should be very grateful to. You might say, Balu, you should learn to modulate your tonality. Well, I'm an old dog. I speak this way. I'm 61 years old. I won't change it. and for nobody. I love this way of talking. I love this way of confrontation. And this is what I've been teaching my students in Europe, in India, to do. Namely, criticize ideas mercilessly. Do not tie egos to ideas. Because these ideas are what constitute the foundations and parts of knowledge. And don't play with knowledge. She doesn't even know why she's interpreting Gandhi. Well, such is the pretension. She calls her interpretation creative. Creative interpretation or misinterpretation, she says. Is that not pretension? To believe that you are an extraordinarily creative person coming there, what? Interpreting some paragraphs written by somebody who's not even a thinker? What is so great about it? What questions did she answer? What questions did she raise? Why did she do what she did? Well, the answer is very simple. She wrote it for the Kill Bill Grammys of this world, who are in America, the so-called new, interesting young studies in Gandhi. She wants to cite them, she wants to be cited by them and look for a career in bigger, better, well-known universities for a fat job, for a fat salary. So instead of being flattered by the attention given to her, instead of asking, of honestly saying, all this would have been stopped if she had said yesterday, look, I never thought about these questions. I want to think about it. But they are nice questions. It would have stopped there. She didn't do that, did she? She went on the defensive. She begged to differ. What she was differing from, God alone knows. And then, of course, we have colleagues here sitting at this very table gossiping. Now, there's a reason I'm talking in such very clear, unambiguous, harsh terms. I think we have decided to draw a line about this conference. This conference is meant only for those who are seeking truth. You want to seek truth, you want to seek knowledge, come to this conference. You want to teach manners, go and do it in America. Don't come here. Sounds very offensive, sounds very harsh. Again, please don't use psychological terms. These are the terms and the conditions of being a student of knowledge. Remember what Dante said is written as a banner to the entrance of hell. Those who wish to enter this, leave thy ego behind. That's what you have to leave if you come into the inferno called intellectual and political, intellectual discussions on important issues. So the issues we're discussing is not a matter of joke. We're not writing papers because we want to be cited or come in the citation index or because we want jobs elsewhere. We are writing because we believe we have seen something in the world which we find important to be communicated. We find what is communicated should be unambiguous. We feel that what is unambiguous should be believed to be true by the communicator. And because it's believed to be true, the person should either defend his or her position, or failing which, getting questions she or he cannot answer, must have the intellectual humility, not the intellectual pretension, intellectual humility to say, I don't know. Because as researchers, there is much that we don't know. So if you lack that humility, I'll tell you what kind of humility is. I was telling just Stephen the other day. There's this wonderful story about Sir Isaac Newton, who I consider to be one of the three great geniuses humankind has ever produced. It appears someone came to Isaac Newton, I don't know, at a party, and said, "Sir, you are the greatest genius on earth, and that should make you feel good." Isaac Newton is supposed to have replied as follows: "Even the shortest of the pygmies sees further than the tallest of the men if he stands on their shoulders. And I, sir," said Newton, "am standing on the shoulder of giants." You see, this intellectual humility comes from true knowledge. You don't get pretension when you have knowledge. You realize how much it is, how infinite is your ignorance about the world. So I should like to raise a question to all of you here to begin with in the panel as to whether we are a chat club teaching Californian manners to people all over the world, or are we here to search for truth? If the first, some of you are in the wrong place, and we shall correct the mistake in the future. If the second, I say, welcome to the club. I thank you.
I think there's something very important at stake here. I mean, I can just talk from my own experience in the US, where I spent some time in academic circles. Something which is especially important in the context of the study of India and Indian culture and society. Because if you look at what's happened in the United States, academia, when it comes to India, is there is a poisonous atmosphere, very clearly so, where people indeed do backpatting in public and never openly challenge scholars with alternative positions, but then during coffee and tea breaks, they start gossiping about how someone is Hindutva, and anyone who speaks in a different way about Indian culture and society and who's not very, derogatory about Indian culture and society is branded as Hindu nationalist in the corridors of academic conferences. I think that has really paralyzed the study of India for quite some time. And it's very important, if there are intellectual disagreements, to state them very openly. I mean, we can be kind in private, but in public, it's very important to state our disagreements very openly, very clearly, and sometimes very intensely. Now, people may have differences in style there. I still cringe sometimes when Balu speaks, but that's because I'm a European as well. I think that's a matter of degree. I haven't, to be honest, I've been struggling with that question myself to some extent. I admire the way Balu states things very clearly, and the way he feels them, he utters that, he expresses that very obviously. Now, sometimes I also thought, does he have to put things that way? I've thought that many times at the earlier conferences, the Rethinkings, or when we were in the US together or in Europe together. But then it's also become clear to me more and more that the way he emotionally expresses his standpoints and ideas precisely avoids the kind of poisonous atmosphere that's been developing in the study of India in America. Because there is no poison underneath. It's just you take a position, you defend it, you attack another person's position, you disagree vehemently, you express cognitive anger. You even say that, look, we don't buy what California is saying, which is very important in an Indian context to say, because for not decades, for centuries, Indians have believed that they should just follow what Europeans have said or Americans have said. So I do think these issues are very important to the study of India today, and not just about this one incident and about our personal disagreements or agreements.
So I hadn't known what we were going to be discussing at this panel, so these are not thoughts that I've given a lot of reflection to, but just a bit of a reaction to what Balu said. And this might be the California reaction. I work and teach in California, though I can assure you that Californians are often quite rude. It's not like Californians are always perfectly gentle and polite. But the part I certainly agree with is that the purpose of conferences and of intellectual discussion is to pursue truth and better understandings of things. It's also a fact, I believe, that it's human beings trying to work together to pursue truth. So that's something that has to be kept in mind as well. And with that in mind, I think it's possible to sort of go astray in different directions. One can, and I've certainly seen the kinds of discussions that Balu describes, and I think those are quite common and lamentable. They're not the best way of pursuing truth. It's possible to go astray at the other end as well. On the sort of spectrum of respect and politeness, I suppose, I spent a semester as a visiting professor at the University of Virginia, and at the law school there, they had a custom of a sort of a Friday afternoon. Every Friday afternoon, someone would present a paper. Everyone was expected to attend, everyone on the faculty, and to have read the papers in advance and be prepared. And it became apparent that the ethos was that this was a situation in which the questioners were competing to see who could ask the most devastating question, who could destroy the paper the most effectively. And it was kind of like a macho game in a sense. I pulverized the speaker, more effectively than other people did. Now, actually, even that had a sort of valuable function. I'm not entirely critical of even that. It did make people work and try to be sharp and so forth. But it probably wasn't the most conducive way of pursuing truth. It seemed as if it was more of some sort of a joust or a competition than a mutual attempt to achieve better understandings and so forth. So I tend to think that the ideal, we never fully achieve any ideal, is something in between in which we should feel free to be critical, to express, questions and dissatisfactions and criticisms and so forth, but that we try to do it in a respectful way, because once again, it's human beings who inevitably, have their feelings and their commitments and so forth, and are trying to engage and so forth. And there is some risk that the enterprise will go astray if we don't respect that as well. So none of us ever achieve this fully, and it leaves certain questions unanswered. I mean, it is true sometimes, I think, that someone will present a paper that really does strike a lot of people as just so wrong-headed and unthought out that it really is just kind of a stupid paper. I'm not saying that was true yesterday, but sometimes that does. I had, I think, a more positive evaluation of the paper yesterday than some others did. But sometimes that does happen, and you also understand that to say that in an honest way, it would probably not only be destructive of the sort of human interchange that we hope to happen, but wouldn't really contribute to a pursuit of truth anyway. It would just sort of make it so I think, actually, I hope this doesn't sound like an apology for hypocrisy, but I'm not sure that it's inappropriate for there to be times where the open discussion is more respectful than some of the private discussion. I think my view is just inevitably that's going to be true in some situations, and maybe that's not such a bad thing. But nonetheless, the ideal, I agree with Balu, is definitely the pursuit of truth. And I think it's a matter of, for every one of us, of trying to understand that and think about the best way to do that in a constructive and respectful way, I think, is the ideal, that will still allow for very, very strong criticisms and debate about disagreements and so forth. That would be my quasi-California take, I guess, on the question.
My reaction is that I think collectively we learn from this discussion here that it is not an issue of India, the US, or something, or certain persons. It's a global issue today. It's a global phenomenon today that scholarship is heavily politicized. It's not just happening in discussions about India or discussions about development in certain parts of the world. In every single conference that I've seen in the past few years, this is the kind of phenomenon that people disagree in quite specific ways sometimes, and sometimes pleasant and sometimes unpleasant ways. But I think what we are facing here, we are sitting in a conference on rethinking religion in India, but we're actually talking not only about religion, we're talking about the whole field, everything. History, politics, law, you name it, okay? And the challenge put before us here, I mean, when you started talking now, unorthodox paths, well, we're in a field that is crowded. We're in a historical setting where, you know, for thousands of years people have debated all sorts of issues. Can we be unorthodox? Yeah? I mean, we are building on whatever is there. A lot is there already. And I'm not sure whether we are desperately trying to do something new when in fact what we need to do is to put 1 and 1 and 2 and 2 or whatever together, maybe in a different way. I don't know. Maybe that's the unorthodoxy that you're asking for. I don't understand this as yet. Yeah? But what I'm observing here, and not for the first time, is that in a conference where one looks at a country scenario or a larger scenario and works on these issues in an interdisciplinary manner, we are all working in our own specific methodologies, with subject-specific approaches. And we don't speak the same language. We don't have the same techniques of dealing with academic work. Our practices differ. And our approaches to how we deal with our topics and how we handle them and how we present our findings and discuss things differ. And I think what we are seeing here is that we ought to probably not dwell on what happened, but maybe try and look ahead. You know, where do we go from here? What do we learn from here? So to turn this into something constructive, how can we engage in a deeper, if you like, interdisciplinary conversation? That's the wrong word, in a sense, it's an American word, yeah? In an academic discourse and debate that takes us collectively further than trying to push for particular angles or particular perspectives, because there are so many different perspectives, whether we call it postmodern or whatever, yeah? Academia is composed of many different subjects and perspectives. And I think we also need to respect that and the fact that we have so many different types of academics round the table and in the room. And I've been wondering, why have I been called to this? And I thought it was because I'm a specialist on, you know, classical and modern Indian law. But we are talking about religion, we are talking about all sorts of things. So I'm prepared to make some contribution to this, but I didn't see that I couldn't make much of a contribution because this wasn't really about India. It was indeed about something else. And that's good in a way, because you wanted it to be about something else. But maybe the next conference needs to address that in some form. So how do we manage to create a discourse that achieves what you want us to achieve? It's still not clear to me what you want us to achieve. Thank you.
I think that is what we want to do. We want to look ahead. That's why we're here sitting at the table today. And I think somehow the last two interventions somehow miss the point, the main point I think Balu was making. We took Farah very seriously yesterday as a scholar. We took her very seriously. True, I mean, we didn't see it as an exchange of pleasantries and maybe there should be some things you can formulate differently, but you cannot say that we didn't take her seriously as a scholar. And let me speak for myself. I think what I tried to do with my comment, I really tried to focus on what was, according to me, a problem in her argumentation, something that, according to me, I think that's why I'm sitting here at the round table, was an important element that was missing in her argumentation. But then, if the response to that later is that you should be nicer, and that she said nice things about something that I've written, and that I didn't respond to that, I think that's besides the point. I don't even see the connection. And it's fairly simple in a way. Yeah?
Look, I mean, I, like Steve, am an American. I also did my law degree in California. I have to wonder when Balu says this, is he talking about me or not? You know, should I now feel unwelcome at this conference? I had actually thought that we were going to wrap. I had a warm, fuzzy feeling. I know now that I'm meant not to have that warm, fuzzy feeling because there's something inherently wrong in it. But I had felt that, in fact, we'd had a full and frank discussion on the platform panels. I regret that, you know, because of my sore throat, which was worse yesterday, I wasn't at Farah's panel. Although maybe it's best that I wasn't there to witness whatever happened because it seems that it was quite confrontational. But you know, you can't make these, if we're going to have lectures about academic ethics, you can't make these kinds of broad brushstroke claims about this group or that national group does this or doesn't do that. I don't even know if Farah is from the United States or not originally. I think in my experience there are many American scholars who are quite serious. They learn the languages, they learn the histories, they do their best to accurately represent India and everything else that is their field of study. It's just wrong to say that this group is disingenuous, that it behaves differently in private than in public. And of course, I can't help but reflect on the fact that there's a complete contrast between that kind of value judgment and what we were talking about, especially the first 2 days on the platforms, where it seemed to me you were saying that the truth versus falsehood distinction in speech is very different in India than it is in the West. And on the other hand, that is not something that should be the subject of pejorative evaluation. In other words, we should understand that there are simply different norms of conversation in different cultures. I myself am enculturated. Well, you know, I went to this place, Chicago, where supposedly people are very rude and they ask tough, pointed questions, and maybe that's not what I do myself, but that's their reputation. And yet my own impulse would be to listen respectfully and probably to avoid controversy, and maybe that's just personal proclivity, which I understand we don't share, and there's some difference here. And what I would say is that anyone who comes to this conference, if they know anything about it or have been to one in the past, understand that there's going to be controversy. That's something that's simply expected and that you have to put up with. But I think we've spent so much time at this conference, apparently, talking about ethics and how one ought to discuss things that we haven't talked about enough of the substance, it seems to me. And I also felt that in the platforms because there was such a regimentation provided first by the structure of the paper and then by the limitations that were placed in the discussion of the paper on what we could actually say in response to the paper, that I felt like at some point I couldn't say anything anymore, right? Especially as an historian. I mean, and then at some point, especially on the second day of the platforms where you, Bala, were saying, you know, we can't talk about the history because the history is not relevant, introducing these complications. Well, I'm an historian. I mean, that's what I do. And so I'm wondering why it is that I'm here then, if not to somehow invoke that kind of historical knowledge and bring that to bear in the conversation. So, I mean, I don't exactly know what to think at this point, but that's just sort of my frustrated reaction.
So I would try to locate this discussion with a question how such conferences can be better platforms for discussion, for seeking knowledge. So taking this instance, for last 3 days I found 3 types of blockades for our search or our open discussion. I don't swear that there are only 3 types. People can add many more types. But these 3 I am locating. And any discussion which is aiming at arriving at a higher level of truth has to take these into consideration. So I hope I am not talking irrelevant thing for this conference. First thing is, yesterday Farah's instance, actually as one of the persons who reacted to that, I was quite seriously engaged with that paper. I had read it thrice. I had discussed with my friends, and I was quite serious in Actually, I was trying to work out how Farah can come out of her. She was trying something, but how can she come out of that? So, for me, it's not only my personal view, but my little experience in academics. I feel that unless and until we address cultural difference and the colonial consciousness overlappings, one cannot clearly understand the figures like Gandhiji, and I put forth the same argument. Later on, Balu reacted to that, and actually Balu pointed out many limitations of that paper. And it was limitation of paper, not any individual, not Farah. And language was also not unparliamentary. It was actually, it was a sort of criticism of the paper. But what I expected was that a scholar like Farah, she looks quite young, and she wants to grow in that field. This is a rare opportunity where she is told about the limitations of the paper. She should not accept it. But certainly when one has to rethink, there should be some antithesis kind of thing which will show your limitations. So that is a rare opportunity for any researcher. And that too, when it happens in the conferences, one has to take it in positively. And the way she started answering it, as though she has answer for everything, she became defensive. I thought she's not getting the point. And if that is the attitude of the researchers, then I don't think they will not be able to figure out the limitations of their own thinking and their own practice in intellectual world. And that is one of the great hurdles of a researcher, which one has to overcome if he has to progress. It's not that one has to accept anyone's view, but this is learning process for how to think. One has to be open, humble. Second thing, these ideological positions. Yesterday, I think others will talk about it, but from my angle, from feminist angle, there was some remark about Balu's reference to the act of rape in Western culture, Indian culture, and its consequences. The one member who reacted to that was quite furious, and as though it was some criminal act by Balu. There I was reminded that actually it is one thing, ideology, which blocks our ways out of this, actually where we are stuck up in any research. We have some ideology and we don't want to go out of it, and it becomes an emotional thing. And not only it was not simply an ideology, I experienced how these colonial structures, they impose upon us, and how violent they are. Because when we are talking that this is one way of looking at our cultural reality and we want to provide an alternative theory, I want to cite one of the examples from my culture, and now that standpoint or framework just violently it tries to push me, telling that I would be criminal if I think like that. So this is something which doesn't allow you to progress in your research. I think one has to give up such blockades. The third thing, sentiments. There were nationalist sentiments. And when one talks about tradition, it's not with sentiment, because intellectuals are talking about tradition with some intellectual pursuits. Or when one talks about Indian culture, one talks it in terms of pursuit of knowledge. But people easily misunderstand it as some sentimental approach, and they just deviate the discussion. So these are the three main things what I found that they were blockading our meaningful discussion for last 3 days.
I find that the moral compulsions have been dogging our steps not just in terms of how we ought to behave or whether we misbehaved or whether there should have been some kind of interaction or another. In fact, I think the nature of what we think social scientific research is dogging our path. And that's one of the problems that Balu is constantly, or we are constantly faced with. Because when Balu or any of us in our papers make a statement about what is, immediately the question is turned around in terms of what ought or ought not to be. In the sense, so Balu's statement about truth and lies, a distinction which exists in the West, and lies and deception, sorry, and a distinction that exists in the West and a distinction that perhaps does not exist. I'm getting it wrong anyway, but let's take that distinction. And what happens is that there are two reactions that immediately kick in when this kind of a statement is made. So one reaction is, like the gentleman yesterday had, Balu is saying that India is a dark continent, it has had no acquaintance with truth or law, etc., and the West is a golden measure that we ought to move towards. So Balu's description becomes akin to a statement about what ought or ought not to be the case in India or in the world. But interestingly, the second reaction that takes place is also equally a moral reaction, though it seems just social science. Because, for instance, the kinds of problems with the statement that are raised. This is ignoring pluralism, this is essentialist, this is about you cannot talk about India in this way, all of this. You begin to wonder why. If it's a description, then either you say you're wrong or you're right. Either there are examples or theories that prove that this is in fact the case, or there are examples or theories that say, but you can't say this because I've got proof you can't do this. What is this external moral compulsion to not speak in particular terms which are essentialist or something else? And I thought that the discussion around rape became a great example of that, because it seemed both an academic as well as a sentimental discussion at the same time, and a lot of things suddenly just came out very clearly. So if you look at that example, or you look at what happened, Balu says, or something about, in the Western culture, this is how rape is conceptualized. And in the Indian culture, obviously, how we conceptualize rape must be very, very different, because one of the solutions that is offered is that the rapist marries the victim. What is offensive about this statement? What makes, or how does it become offensive? You have to say, A, that Balu advocates that victims be married to the rapist. Which is to say, okay, he's taking a moral statement. He's making something about this ought to be the actions that take place. He's not saying that at all. He's saying you have this example here, you have this structure of solving problems here, and you have another structure there. But just this step would not be enough, because you need another step. He advocates that rapists should be married to the victim, since rape ought not to have any trauma associated with it. So since Balu said something about there doesn't seem to be in the conception of rape, in this way of solving the problem, trauma attached to the victim, Balu is again advocating that women ought not to be traumatized. But that's not a moral statement at all. He's not making any statements about what ought or ought not to be, what women ought or ought not to feel. And the next steps that got taken in the way that we discussed the matter became even more interesting, because then it becomes who can speak about rape. So it's not just about a woman can speak about rape and a man cannot, but let's say Naomi's intervention that there are interests at play. You have to again draw from a moral compulsion to say he's saying this only because his interests are that women ought not to be traumatized by rape. So again, there's a baggage of intention loaded to moral compulsion, which acts further in terms of understanding this situation. So then you found the moral culprit, the man who speaks of rape in this way, is this. And the third step is when, for instance, Professor Mensky says, you see, students, the world is necessarily postmodern, and we ought not to speak in this way. We have to take plural consideration. We have to take into consideration pluralism. Now, here is where the irony lies, because not only is it that social sciences are taking on the garb of, or are actually, it's moral science that's taking on the garb of social sciences, it's also a very singular, a very principled, a very single strand that is allowed to exist as social science. So the world has to be more postmodern. I have to be postmodern. I have to be liberal. I have to be something. And this is in the name, ironically, of pluralism. So if seeking knowledge means that I have to learn what I ought to be, then sorry, I think, most of us did that in third standard moral science classes. We ought not to be going, we keep coming up against this obstruction. So instead, if there is a description of what is, then let's dispute it at the level of what is, rather than what ought or ought not to be. Thank you.
Yeah. Actually, I'm somewhat at a loss to know what to say, because actually, I don't know what the expectation was from this particular session, but I thought maybe there was some idea floating around that one would try to have a discussion about the prospects of teaching comparative law in India and so on, but perhaps that's not. Are people interested in doing that, or? I know that there are other issues which are playing on people's minds. So and it's right that they're discussed, but I didn't really come prepared to have a discussion about yesterday's discussion. So the one thing that I can say from Farah's paper that actually, yes, there may have been sentiments which are hurt and so on, but I actually found it a little insight into this because I found, perhaps somewhat naive. I did find myself nodding along to Farah's paper because somehow her 3 R's seemed to make sense to me, and maybe I was simply making intuitive sense of them, right? So in a way, I was almost in the same position that she was, because I was somehow clustering in the same way that she was, without knowing what background assumptions she was making in order to make those clusters, right? And then when the critique started to kind of come from around the table and from Balu, I realized that there was that weakness in the paper, right? And I had assumed that she would have some answers for that, but actually she didn't. She didn't have substantive answers for making a decision to cluster Gandhi's use of religion in that particular way, in that particular threefold framework. So for me, just as a listener, it was a kind of learning experience. That's what I would say in relation to Farah's paper. Thanks.
See, I was really surprised when I came to know that somebody, I think it's Vivek, said that Farah appeared to be a bit upset about. I was surprised because if I were to be in her position, I don't find any reasons, because I faced such kind of this one before. I presented a paper, and that happened to me many times. But I never even thought once that that's a kind of attack on me. So when Vivek suggested Balu, that, you talk to her, see that, it's not, we are sorry if we hurt her and all those things. But when she reacted the way she did, I am surprised, because I held her, especially the background of this kind of conference and the kind of this one, minimum standard that we expect. And I also had read her paper. I never thought that her paper is in any way either inferior or of less quality and all those things. And so, like me, I think all the other members who are in the panel were also must have thought that it is some important paper, some important kind of argument that we have to respond to. But her reaction, made me think, I don't know whether I'm right or wrong, this is similar to the kind of reactions that we face in kind of smaller conferences. That, if at all, one thing I think I told Werner, that one thing we all agree, those of us who are working in different universities here in India, especially in Karnataka, that what he said about legal education applies very much to social science also. It's in a very pathetic situation. Therefore, conferences become meaningless. So it becomes a totally meaningless exercise that we almost stop going to attending conferences. Either it is just a formality of going and presenting a paper, or there is another category that you present a paper not based on your research, but based on your kind of stand taken, the argument based on the stand, the correct, politically correct stand that you take, and anything that is opposed to that is completely, immediately dropped off. And there is a third category that, they think they know, but actually they do not know anything. So you are not supposed, they are the people who kind of, who are not supposed to be attacked or asked questions, because asking questions itself becomes a kind of this one. So we are familiar with these three kinds of categories. But we never expected that people would be thinking that way here. Because, she did not even think that my question merited an answer. When I asked only simple two things, because if she had understood, she put Sarah, Balu and Jacob's argument in R3, category religion 3. No, I know, because if she had understood the argument very well, she could not have done that, because if she had understood that argument, that could not have come under the category of religion at all. And in fact, that is the argument which actually demolishes R1 R2. So this is one I wanted her reaction. Maybe I thought that maybe she has her arguments. And I also talked about Gandhi. See, it's also possible to understand Gandhi, whatever she was saying, within that context, that Gandhi intuitively understood something about how the traditions work, but he was putting in a language which becomes unintelligible when he was communicating. What if we look at the whole argument this way? What is in this that, which actually hurts anybody? The language was not crude. No, there was no, this one also saying that it was a kind of, her argument was totally worthless. So, this is, once we thought that this kind of conferences would help us to go forward, because in our earlier experience, the different kinds of other conferences that we attended, we never thought they were open to different kinds of argument at all. See, the reaction normally that in most of the times that we face is that they don't agree with us. They say, we don't agree with you. They don't seem to agree. But they don't state why. That's the problem. See, they have the freedom to say that we don't agree with you. So I cannot quarrel if somebody tells me that I don't agree with you. But if at all both of us are interested in carrying the intellectual exercise forward, then it is a responsibility of the people who don't agree with me to say that why they don't agree. Otherwise, the whole intellectual exercise becomes meaningless. So this is what, I'm not keeping anybody in mind, but this is what I personally feel, and also which actually helps our research project. Thank you.
I don't know if I should say this or not. Just very brief. It's just one. I take it that the main purpose of this discussion is to talk about kind of like the ethos and the ethics and the etiquette of conferences and intellectual discussion and so forth, and not primarily to put Farah on trial or anything like that. But there has been a lot of talk about her, and somehow it seems to me that it would be an injustice if one of the consequences of our discussion were to leave the conclusion that somehow she was really deficient sort of intellectually or in character or something of that sort. So without commenting on trying to make any judgments about the substantive quality of the paper, which I'm really unqualified to do, and without suggesting that the substance of any of the criticisms were bad, because most of them struck me as, at least definitely worth presenting and, very legitimate criticisms to make, I think we'd have to acknowledge that that it's a very understandable sort of human situation, the reaction that she would have had to, just a whole series of very cutting criticisms. Came across. And then what I think probably was, I don't actually know Farah, but I think I can imagine myself in her situation, especially if I were just a young professor. And I think we'd have to take into account well, I don't know what the right adjective would be, the stature of Balu in these kinds of gatherings, who press some entirely legitimate criticisms very energetically, it seemed to me, if I could put it that way. Considering all that, then to say that someone who felt a little bit, upset afterwards, that just seems to me like a very natural sort of human thing to be, and it just seems to me that it would be very unfair for us to think that to leave thinking that reflected some sort of deficiency on her part. I just feel like maybe on behalf of a fellow Californian, I understand she teaches not too far from where I teach. Maybe I should just add that small sort of personal defense for what it's worth.
You're asking me to eat a banana, just as the way the person in the plenary was explaining a guru setting the standard to eat a banana under certain conditions, and I simply refuse to eat that banana because the conditions that you have set for me are utterly impossible. Now, if you'd like me to explain those conditions, I will, but I want to tell you right now, I refuse to eat the banana.
Well, I think, as I suggested yesterday, I think perhaps we should have focused on, I think Farah Godrej's paper as an example. I think what is being discussed is the response that discussion, that exchange supposed to have been invoked. So as an example of that, rather than whether the quality of Farah's paper or actually what went on. But I think, as I was trying to say yesterday, I think it would have been far more productive, I think, if we focused on saying, how the people on the platform, each of them think about research and setting up research problem. Because I think it's, I'm a California trained, so I sort of, I can take on the criticism. I'm a California trained, and I sort of, it's not that gives me the right to speak about what California intellectual climate is, but I do realize that in the last 20 years, especially, I think the post-Saidian and the cultural studies that sort of took root in the States, there is a kind of a real serious undermining of intellectual discussion in favor of highly normativized, posturing. That has taken place, and I've been witness to it, and perhaps I even participated in it because I was at the birthplace of all post-coloniality and cultural studies. And that is not a remark about any persons. I think there is a dangerous intellectual trend that has taken root, which prevents any discussion from taking place, and it constantly prevents asks you to take issues off the agenda. Whereas you want the whole idea of intellectual inquiry should be to put even the most difficult agendas on the table and to be able to speak about it. Whereas a kind of formulation has emerged where talking about, usually the subalterns as a catchword for practically everyone, you have to be speaking in a certain way. It's not as though otherwise people would be speaking badly of them. It's just that you can't be speaking about, in India, for example, if you're talking about minorities, you have to exercise 100 different caution to speak about it. But it's not clear why these restrictions are imposed, how they're imposed. Whereas the idea is to actually, I think the example of rape is a good one because precisely because it's not clear what the imputation is. But everyone is put on the alert. But you want to ask why everyone is put on the alert about that. Surely it can't be anybody's contention that Balu was advocating, that rape is good or anything of the kind. So why is there that kind of how do you put it? I mean, I keep thinking, that there is an attempt to put things off the agenda. And in fact, it's strange that, we're talking about this in relation to a paper which discussed Gandhi, because one of the greatest things about Gandhi was that the courage with which he said everything should be on the agenda. There was nothing that he was scared of discussing. Whereas the academic world has come to such a pass that in India, for example, as we've been facing this, and I think that's probably why we want to make it into there's a point to bringing this question back. If you raise questions of religion, question of caste system, these are not to be spoken about because everyone already knows what it is. That you're only supposed to take a certain posture about it, so that no inquiry is possible anymore. And this is the kind of a discussion that we want to avoid. I mean, this is this kind of normativized posturing which goes by the name of cultural studies or post-coloniality, unfortunately. Which is not to say that there are no patches of inquiry where people don't do any discussion. Obviously, that's not the claim at all. As Professor Smith said, wherever in Virginia, but that is also an example of certain kind of a really ruthless discussion that's supposed to be taking place in analytic philosophy, which Nozick talks about. The whole idea, if a speaker comes, is to just undermine the person. The idea is to make the person say that I surrender. I drop dead. Clearly, that is not an ideal of intellectual investigations. But here, I think what is happening is something that we need to recognize. That there is a constant attempt to force you to take the agendas off. And this pluralization, constant pluralization and this contestation, the idea that everything is contested, secularism is always contested. I mean, this kind of a priori statement, it is, or that if I talk about tradition, whose tradition are you talking about? Traditions are plural. I mean, have you made an investigation that traditions are plural? No. These are all, I'm saying that these are a priori normative statements that keeps coming at you where they just conversation stoppers. You can't go any deeper into these issues. And as I said, for me, yesterday I was thinking when it looked like Gandhi's conception of truth was, made to look like a Protestant conception of truth. I was saying, how can that be right? I mean, look at what Gandhi Satyagraha is. And perhaps, and this is a thought that struck me in the night, that perhaps research tradition should be like Gandhi Satyagraha. In fact, Gandhi Satyagraha was, in a deep sense, satyagraha. That is, that it is living as an inquiry, perhaps the prototype of all inquiries. That we insist, agraha, standing in truth, and you insist. And that is a kind of a seriousness, and that's a kind of a thing that the attention that we need to bring back to academic inquiry, where discipline and interdisciplinarity do not matter. I mean, those are resources. You raise questions and then look around. Okay, maybe you have these resources that you can bring and help me with my question. But they themselves are nothing. So I feel that perhaps, the reason it is not that any one example, but that there is a state of inquiry, and especially inquiry about in social sciences and cultural studies, which is blocking off inquiries. And whereas we should be making every effort, like in some sense Gandhi did, to say, look, let's put the most contentious issues back on the agenda. Let's make academic life alive. Let's make the questions matter, not paffing, not posturing. Those should not take the place of inquiry. That inquiry, these places are shrinking. These places are shrinking in India rapidly. That is, some of you may know about this thing. The Parliament apologized for a cartoon which is supposed to have offended a community. Parliament. And everyone knows that, anyone with a minimal knowledge of history knows that this could not have been the case. Shankar's cartoon about it is about the Constitution where Ambedkar is sitting on a snail and Nehru is holding a whip, and apparently this offended the community, and our minister Kapil Sibal apologized to the community, and then there was a committee set up to go through all these cartoons in this textbook to see which is politically right and which is politically correct. But this is not a joke. The intellectual life is in serious danger, where it is shrinking. The inquiry is shrinking. You cannot take certain questions, even in seminars now. So whereas our fight should be to say, look, seminar and classrooms are at least places where you can bring the most contentious issues and have an inquiry. And I agree with Professor Minsky if he meant that, that there is a great politicization of in a bad sense. It is always said as a great thing that, everything is political, but I think that's a disaster. The disastrous to intellectual inquiry. And in India, I recognize this because I live it. So I think at a deep level, I think this is what we are trying to combat, and asking participants to say that, look, we must rethink inquiry. We must give certain seriousness, urgency to inquiry, because intellectual inquiry is extremely important, and that the space for it is shrinking.
Thank you, everyone, for being present here at the Roundtable and in the audience. And we will close the session for today, unless you want to say a few things. No. Thank you, everyone.